Securing the ceasefire.
Salam and good evening. I'm Nadiah Latif and you're watching Palestine, the Untold Story. The debate over what sparked the most recent Israel-Palestine escalation differs, depending on which side you're on. Now, strong words have been thrown from both sides, all that carry implication. Is it a conflict and self-defense? Is it a territorial dispute or occupation? Or is it apartheid and massacre? Starting from the Palestinian protest in East Jerusalem over the Supreme Court of Israel's decision that led to the eviction of 6 Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah, to the violence at Al-Aqsa Mosque at the end of Ramadan 2021. The violence that ensued and the ceasefire we now have all but show the fragility of peace, the rising of the oppressed, and possibly the making of a new yet checkered history. Tonight, in the first episode of our 2-part series, I am privileged to have my teammate, Arief Subhan, and shortly after, we will be speaking to Dr. AZZAM TAMIMI, political activist in Jordan. Thank you for being with us, Arief.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine, alhamdulillah.
And, you know, if we talk about what's happening today, there's so many things that's happening, so many sides of the story, but I think it's important to look at history to understand a little bit more about the context.
That's right.
We need to understand the origin story or where things came from. Now, to start up with, depending on which part of the world you're in, you would either be told that Palestine's origin dates back millions of years ago, in fact, all the way back to the Iron Age, or you would be told that Palestine was never a sovereign state, right? And if you look at the strategic location, it was between Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, and of course became the birthplace of both Judaism and Christianity. We know that this region has had a long and rather tumultuous history.
Right.
You know, from everything from the clashes of religion, culture, economy, politics. So if we look at the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the effect the Turks had in unfortunately joining the World War I, all the
by
way,
compulsion, of course.
Yes, correct. To Jerusalem falling into the British hands in December 1917, there has been several pivotal moments in history that we need to understand to fully appreciate the complexities of the situation and why things have turned out the way it is. Now, when we were talking about World War I earlier before the program, Arief, we talked about the Balfour Declaration, we talked about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So, in your interest in history, politics, and eschatology, could you weigh in on what were some of the key points in history?
All right. First and foremost, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil anbiya wa mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, alhamdulillah. This topic is a very interesting topic because it's pertinent to us now, and it has been pertinent, it has been relevant for a long time.
Yes.
My interest in the subject matter is because it's not only a religious matter, but it's a matter that is involving many people's lives. It's about politics, it's about culture, about history. And the notion of eschatology, as mentioned, is quite compelling because we tend to forget that there is an element of eschatology, which is essentially the study of the end of times.
Yes.
And in scripture, is going by what a lot of people talk about in terms of the trajectory of history. The place where Israel is now situated in is considered holy and sacred. Yes. That's why the dimension of religion plays a very important role here.
Holy and sacred to more than one group or community or
Correct,
religion,
yeah.
right?
The three Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So initially, in 1917, the Balfour Agreement, we have Arthur Balfour, a representative of the UK, who made the decision essentially of having Israel where it is now, when they wanted a state for themselves. The initial proposition was that the state of Israel, as it is and as it were now, is supposed to be somewhere in Uganda or Argentina.
Yes, in Uganda.
Yeah.
That we would have never thought.
No, yeah, and this is because of the religious aspect of it again. This is to play to the religious dimension, to galvanize the spirit of the Jews, who at the time were, believers of Judaism, to this day believers of Judaism. And the issue is that when you have this support in a religious backing, essentially, you could actually use it as a catalyst to have a lot of people to essentially galvanize support for the cause, which is the Zionist project, which was heralded by Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism.
That's right. Now we're going to be going to our guest tonight. We hear a lot about the geopolitics of things, Arief, but I'd like to also start with a history closer to home. Tonight we're privileged to have Dr. AZZAM. You were born and you lived in Hebron in the Palestinian-occupied West Bank until you were 7, just a few years after the Palestinian catastrophe of Al-Nakba of 1948. So first and foremost, Dr. AZZAM, it's a pleasure and honor to have you tonight. Could you share what it was like growing up in Hebron?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. Well, you see, I was born, as you said, a few years after the Nakba, or 7 years after 1948. And I consider myself, as I say in the first chapter of my autobiography, which I have just started writing, that I am a child of the Nakba, simply because my mother and her family were forced to flee their hometown, Beersheba, which is today in 1948 Palestine, or what they call Israel. And they came to Hebron, Al-Khalil, my father's hometown, where she and my father married afterwards, and I was one of their children. When I was born, Al-Khalil, or Hebron, was part of Jordan, because after 1948, what remained of Palestine was divided into two parts. What is known as the Gaza Strip, and that was placed under Egyptian rule, and the West Bank, which was joined with East Jordania, or East Jordan, and became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So strictly speaking, or technically, I was born as a Jordanian national, like hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank. But at the age of 7, my father decided to go and work in Kuwait, like many Palestinians who went to earn a living, as the situation in Palestine was quite tough for them. And therefore, I grew up really in Kuwait until I finished secondary school there. My story with Palestine is not a unique story. It's a story you will hear from millions of Palestinians, because we share the same pain, we share the same hopes and aspirations. It is longing to go back to our homeland, because that's our homeland and the homeland of our ancestors.
Could you share a little bit about what we're seeing on screen? I know that some of these photos hold dear to you.
Yes, the picture you've just shown is of my parents and my siblings. In 1974, as I was sitting for secondary school exams in Kuwait, they went and visited Palestine, occupied Palestine, and they actually managed to go all the way to Beersheba, my mother's birthplace, and that is my mother's house where they stood. And at the time, I remember my mother said to me that it had been turned into a police station, but I think today it's, or probably at the time they visited, it was some sort of an NGO or something civic belonging to the Israelis. And she told them, she told the people in the house that this was the place she was born, and they said to her, "Go back to wherever you came from. You Arabs don't belong here." And she sat under a tree in front of the house and wept until she almost fainted.
Yeah, let's bring back that photo that we just saw just now, because I want to bring this very important point. A lot of people see Palestine in the news and all you see is flat land, rubble, people screaming, crying, and violence. And we forget that Palestine was a thriving society. It had everything from automotive expos to, where men and women were equally contributing to society. A lot of people were talking about the oppressed, but very much unlike what you see in the media, Palestine was a very different place.
With real lives and real people.
Correct,
lived
exactly.
experiences.
Dr. Azzam, you shared with me some stories that your mother had told you when you were growing up about how she was basically extracted or taken away from her family home. Could you share a little bit more about that memory?
You see, what happened, this is a story that my mother told me, and this is a story that you read about in so many biographies. The Zionists started perpetrating massacres in certain places, the most infamous of which is the massacre of Deir Yassin, where they slaughtered hundreds of Palestinian women, children, and unarmed men. And the news of those massacres spread quite rapidly across Palestine, and people were afraid that the same thing would happen to them. At the same time, unfortunately, several Arab governments who were still at the time not really fully independent told the Palestinians they were coming in to protect them and prevent the takeover of Palestine by the Zionists. And many Palestinians, like my mother's family, closed their doors and took the keys, left all their belongings inside the house, and thought they were going away for a week or two maximum, and then they were coming back again. But it was a total disaster. It was a disappointment. These Arab armies were not really real in any way. Some of them even, well, some did actually put up a little bit of struggle, but mostly these governments were under the control of the same colonizers who facilitated for the Zionists to take over in Palestine. And my mother never really overcome that, and she died actually quite young. My mother was in her early 50s, because as a result of the Nakba and being driven out of her home, she developed heart problems, and she kept having these until she passed away at the age of about 53 or 54.
Thank you so much for sharing that really humbling story. We forget that there are families and there are lives that are disrupted and that are lost because of war. Any type of violence would lead to not only, as what you shared earlier, Dr. Azzam, in fact, I'm sure there were a lot of people with post-traumatic stress disorder trying to lead a life in a foreign land, being lied to, telling that you would be safe, instead being taken away from your homeland for good. Now, I want to ask you specifically on the Nakba, why was the Al-Nakba a pivotal point in Palestinian-Israel relations?
You see, the roots of this conflict, which many people confuse for a communal conflict, are actually in Europe. They are not in the region. I mean, there's nothing really new about powers coming in and powers leaving. Palestine was always part of a much bigger region that was ruled by different dynasties throughout history. The very last of those dynasties was the Ottoman dynasty, or the Ottoman Empire. But what was new about this is that Europe had a real problem. Europe had a chronic problem, and decided eventually that it could only be solved by creating a Jewish home for the Jews of Europe to just solve the problem and get it over with. And the choice was Palestine. As you rightly said, or it was mentioned in the introduction, the Zionists themselves, Theodor Herzl in particular, who convened the first Zionist Congress in 1897, wanted actually the Zionist entity or the Jewish homeland to be in Argentina or to be in Angola or to be in, I don't know where, in Uganda. He even tried with the Italians asking for Libya to be given to them. He tried with the British asking for Cyprus. But it was the victors in the First World War, primarily the British, who decided that Palestine should be the place where the Jewish state be established, simply because they wanted to prevent that region, which they cut into pieces and shared between them, the British and the French, from ever uniting again, from ever rising. Yep. So they decided that the Zionist entity should be created in Palestine.
Would you say then, Dr. Tamimi, the example of the Zionists carving out the parts of Europe, parts of the Middle East, would you say that this is also an issue of basically of Ashkenazi Jews and the idea or notion of European guilt, essentially?
Indeed, that's definitely part of it. But see, the Zionist movement, which spearheaded this project, initially was a very unpopular movement among the Jews of Europe. Most Jews actually disowned it and didn't want to have anything to do with it, to the extent that Theodor Herzl actually wanted to convene his conference in Zurich, but the Jews of Zurich said to him, don't come to this city, you heretic, you go somewhere else. So he went to Basel, which is a much smaller, tinier town in Switzerland. But it was the will of the superpowers. And that's why you see this conflict is not really religious in its origins. Although religion played and continues to play a major role as a justifier or as a motivator, originally this is just a colonial project, like every other colonial project. The majority of the Jews were opposed to it until about the mid-30s. Until even the beginning of the Second World War and the rise of the Nazis. Later on, because of the Holocaust and because of the disaster that happened in Europe to the Jews, an increasing number of Jews started embracing the Zionist ideology. But Zionism in its origins was not an accepted ideology to the Jews.
Would you say that it's basically, is hijacking too strong a word, a hijacking of Judaism by the Zionist movement? Would you say it's a strong word or it's an apt word to use?
Well, it's exploitation. It's the use of religion. And this happens in every religion, by the way. I mean, we Muslims have similar problems. Sometimes there are people who, in the name of Islam, commit atrocities, and Islam is innocent. And I know many Jewish friends, both secular and Orthodox, who consider Zionism to be criminal, and they disown it. There's a brilliant book about this for those who are interested by a friend of mine called John Rose. He used to be a Zionist, and then he came to realize the truth. He wrote a book called The Myths of Zionism, in which he explains that the founders of Zionism were all secular and atheists. Nevertheless, they used the Bible and the stories of the Israelites in order to justify coming to Palestine and dispossessing its people and committing crimes against them.
And we hear quite a lot of this, Dr. Azzam. In fact, if you look at social media today, a lot of pro-Israel influencers are talking about the fact that Israel is their birthright, Israel is their holy land, and they actually quote the Bible. Now, what I'm interested to find out is, why are they quoting the Bible instead of the Torah?
Well, you see, the Bible consists of, the Bible as it exists today, and for the Christians, it consists of the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is, a part of it is the Torah. So the Jews don't believe, of course, in the New Testament, which is the Gospels. They believe only in the Torah and the Talmud. They have another book called the Talmud. But you see, according to the Talmud, and this is explained brilliantly in a book by Israel Shahak, who is a Jewish historian, in a book called Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel, he explains that according to the Talmud, God took a covenant from the Israelites that they shouldn't travel to Palestine with the intention of settling there until the coming of the Messiah toward the end of time. But actually, Zionism is purely political in its origins, not religious. But they needed to convince the Jews so as to join them. So they started saying, oh, God promised the land to us. Now, let's talk about this. Even in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the children of Israel were, during that time, his preferred community. Allah preferred the children of Israel to others during their time. But that was upon a condition, and the condition of being righteous, of being good worshippers, of not attacking others. The same as to the Muslims. Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. Allah tells us about the Muslims, you've been the best community raised for mankind. But this is not a blank check. There are conditions that we have to believe in Allah, we have to obey Him, we have to be righteous, we have to enjoin good, forbid evil. You cannot claim to be God's preferred nations when you are committing crimes. And you cannot claim that God is some sort of a real estate agent who is just dividing this earth between people depending on who He loves or who He doesn't love. God loves the righteous. That's the idea. And for us, of course, Muslims, we believe that Musa alayhi salam was our prophet, Isa alayhi salam was our prophet. So it's the same message, it's a continuation. And that's why I refuse to accept that this is a religious conflict. This is not between the Jews and the Muslims, just like the Crusaders wasn't between the Muslims and the Christians. The Crusaders themselves used the Bible as a pretext in order to come and attack this part of the world and occupying, and they eventually left. And similarly, the Zionists one day will leave.
And we're seeing a repeat of that today with Benjamin Netanyahu using religion as a cause to bring fear towards people, and this continued proliferation of trying to use religion for harm instead of uniting people is all across the internet and every other channel that you can think of. So thank you so much for putting that right up front. I like the fact that you said that God is not a real estate agent, and the condition is if you're going to be the preferred person or the preferred ummah or the preferred servant of God, whichever God that you might believe in, then you have to do right by your religion, which every religion teaches peace. Now, we do have a cutaway from Brother MUNEEB Al-GHAZALEH, who is the country director of International Relief Palestine, whom earlier I had the opportunity to speak with, an amazing gentleman who's done amazing work right now in Gaza, and we asked him about the ceasefire that's happened and what were his thoughts on that. So some of his words on screen.
Yes, it has. The situation has definitely changed since ceasefire. People are starting to be able to go back to their homes, to move around, to assess damages. Institutions and official bodies are working on assessing infrastructural damages as well as damages that have affected people's lives directly, such as homes and micro businesses, and so on. But to tell you the truth, it's not as easy as one might imagine. I mean, Gaza is already a very small area. It's already very crowded. It's already undercapacitated in all the different fields. So people that are looking, for example, for homes to rent until they fix their homes are facing a lot of challenges finding places to available for rent. Even some people are living in small shops that they found empty. I mean, instead of an apartment. This is of course a big challenge because it's directly to the street. It's without latrines. It's not divided properly. So, but they're trying to to find any possible shelter that can host them. Now, the biggest challenge now is the real assessment and the start of the reconstruction stage, which still seems to be challenging because, as far as I know, until yesterday, construction materials are not allowed to enter Gaza. So probably food and medicine are the ones that have been allowed under restrictions as well, but construction material still is not coming in.
So, Brother Muneeb, when we had our conversation and he was actually on a live, FB live session, in the middle of that session, Dr. AZZAM, we could hear a grenade and after that a bomb explode just outside his office. We saw the walls shatter and the internet connection went a bit of a glitch for a few seconds. It was terrifying, not only, of course, for everybody who was there, but everyone that was watching. Could you please comment on some of the things that he has said, Dr. AZZAM?
Well, you cannot but feel very sorry for the people of Gaza. They've been through this so many times. Every time, 2009, 2012, 2014, and now 2021. Gaza is destroyed, its infrastructure, people's houses demolished. But to tell you the truth, it is a remarkable people. This is really a remarkable community. You talk to them, and I've spoken to many of them, and it has not undermined their resolve. They consider this to be a price worth paying in order for the world to see Israel for what it is, to see how criminal this entity. And they will continue, and they will live, and they will rebuild their lives. They started with with sweeping the roads. They will remove the rubble. And hopefully Arabs, Muslims, and justice-loving people around the world will help them with donations in order to rebuild their houses. It's their destiny, and they probably, if they know how much reward is awaiting them in the year after, they'll probably be pleased about what's going on.
MashaAllah, we saw footages during Eid al-Fitr. In fact, it choked me up when I saw a video clip of a brother and a sister who were just so happy that when their house was bombed, they managed to save their pet fish. Did you see that?
I did, yeah.
I was holding back my tears because at the end of the day, we were talking about the fact that humanity exists in all these little pockets of vulnerability. We don't think about it. We don't appreciate it enough. Yeah. When you see these two small children and they're just so happy that the pet fish survived.
It's a reminder of humanity, and it's a reminder of the little things that we often take for granted, right? And essentially, this is the human aspect of the conflict, and not even the conflict, you know, this appetite, essentially. And we need to always look at the little things, and in a way we could learn from them and take in our daily life with more gratitude and sincerity and humility as well.
Gratitude and humility, very well said actually. We did ask another question to Brother Muneeb, and in that question I asked, what can the international community do? What can us as Malaysians watching these programs do to assist our brothers and sisters in Palestine? Now, I want to remind you that the people of Palestine are not just Muslims. There are Christians living in Palestine. There are also Muslims living in Palestine. There are also people who don't believe in any faith still living in Palestine. So Palestine here encompasses everyone that is currently in the occupied West Bank. And this is what he had to say.
Yeah, this is a good question. Actually, number one, in terms of a humanitarian support, I honestly advise everyone to focus on recovery state rather than focusing on emergency response, quick emergency response. Emergency response is still needed. Food and non-food items are still needed, but from what I see, there is enough commitments to fulfill the urgent needs of people. This is number one. Number two, there is the social, if I may say, coherence and social support of people to each other. So this is something that is manageable to a big extent. But the biggest problem is to get Gaza back running, and this means reconstructing the damages, even reconstructing the psychological damages that people have been through. This is the main need for as a response. Now there is another big issue, which is as it's been always said, that Gaza is a protracted humanitarian crisis. So we need not to forget the people that have been already relying on aid and support before the crisis. So it's not only responsive to new cases, but we have to keep in mind the previous cases, especially any sustainable intervention that can be done to the community. Now, in terms of longer term support, Gaza needs the voices of the international community to keep pushing for Palestinians enjoying the basic rights that have been guaranteed to any human being according to international treaties, human rights law, and so on. This is basic regardless of where the situation gets and where the negotiations reach and so on. A resolution at the end of the day has to be reached somehow. But until then, I don't see any reason why not children and people in general enjoy the basic rights that have been guaranteed to them.
Subhanallah, we were talking about basic rights and how here Brother MUNEEB was talking about it's okay, the emergency is manageable, and we should be focusing on long-term recovery. Spoken like a true hero. Dr. AZZAM, I wanted to ask you, he said Gaza needs the voices of the international community. What can we do better?
Well, the international community is a problematic term for me, because who does it refer to? Usually in politics, when they use the international community, they mean the United States of America and its allies. Really, that's what it means. So if we're talking about governments, I don't think we can hope much from Western governments, because until this moment, although there has been some remarkable change in public opinion, and some of which we've just seen over the past few days, but governments haven't moved even 1 millimeter from their positions. And this reminds me of an article I've just been reading, a brilliant article written by a Harvard University professor, who says that the real problem, as far as America is concerned, is this special relationship that America has with Israel that makes America allow Israel to get away with whatever it is doing, whatever it is doing. You saw probably over the past few days that Blinken, the Secretary of State, his master Biden, keep saying Israel has the right to defend itself. Whereas if we go, as we've just been doing in this program, a little bit back in history, we will discover that Israel is the aggressor. The Palestinians are the ones who need to have the right to defend themselves. But if we mean by the international community ordinary people like me and you and others, of course, there's a lot we can do. And apart from the relief, the material relief, I think one of the things that we need to do even better is create awareness around the world as to what exactly happened in this part of the world, why we have this conflict, and compare it with other conflicts. You see, we are not the first people in the world that we struggle for our dignity, our freedom, and our independence. We, in modern history, we saw the Algerians, we saw the Vietnamese, we saw the people of South Africa, and many other nations who rose against colonialism. In Algeria, 132 years, I mean, can you imagine? And then they became free. They got rid of France. South Africa, so many decades of apartheid, racist regime, one of the worst in the world. And then the South African people became free. We, the Palestinians, similarly, will be free one day. But of course, we need to work like those strugglers worked at all levels, from the military to the media, and we need to convince people, ordinary people, that we are the victims and we have the right to defend ourselves and struggle for our rights.
Dr. AZZAM, if we are, after what you've just mentioned about the United States of America being one of the biggest lobbyists for the Israel policy and for Israel democracy, essentially, can we say that Israel in itself doesn't promote democracy because it doesn't give the rights to vote for people of, people from Palestine, essentially? And do you think that if the lobby from the United States of America does not actually go to Israel, would the political dimension be different in the country itself?
Well, again, in the article, this Harvard professor says people think Israel is a democracy, but it's not a liberal democracy. It is a democracy similar to the democracy that existed in white supremacist South Africa, where only if you were white, you had political rights. Now, similarly in Palestine, you need to be Jewish to have political rights. You know, there are many Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, but it means nothing really, because even though they even participate in the elections, their political parties are marginalized. Nobody can protect them. They have a completely different judicial system compared to that dealing with the Jews. It's an apartheid system. And they used to claim they were the only democracy in the region. When the Arabs across the Arab world rose in what is known as the Arab Spring revolutions, Israel was the one who was so frightened of that revolution, because Israel only allies itself with dictatorships in the region. Democracy doesn't help it, because once the Arab peoples are free and have democracy, Israel will be gone. Israel will not find anybody protecting it. You know, Israel is not there just because America is providing it with weapons and funds. It's also there because there are Arab governments, I regret to say, who dedicate their armies and security services to protecting Israel.
And Dr. AZZAM, it's essentially a disservice to the Ummah, right? When you have Arab countries and Arab states that give backing to Israel and give backing to the United States via Israel, essentially, or vice versa. I think if we look at the Quranic injunction, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَائِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً قَالُوا أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَن يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِكُ الدِّمَاءَ وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ وَنُقَدِّسُ لَكَ. If we look at people as human beings and we look at them as Khalifa in this earth, in this world, can we then say that we all have a shared responsibility, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of background, to go against Israel and their very detestable policies?
Well, definitely, and that's why the cause of Palestine has many supporters around the world who are not Muslim, who are not Arab. They are human beings. And someone has just sent me a video clip of a Jewish Holocaust survivor who lives in Canada. And I think he's a psychiatrist or something. It has to do with psychiatry. And he explains how initially he was a Zionist because he thought establishing a homeland for the Jews in Palestine would prevent the repeat of the Holocaust. But then he realized that the creation of the State of Israel was at the expense of somebody else against whom another Holocaust was perpetrated, the Palestinians. You see, you cannot have justice for yourself by denying other people their own right to justice. Justice is a fundamental, is a basic right for all human beings. And if someone is wronged, and I know that the Jews suffered, of course, I believe the Jews suffered in Europe, but it wasn't my mother who killed the Jews. It wasn't my father. It wasn't the Palestinians who perpetrated the Holocaust. It was the Germans. I mean, if the West is so guilty about what happened to the Jews, why are they punishing us to compensate for their sin? Why not pay the victims of the Holocaust from their own countries? Why not establish a Jewish homeland somewhere in Germany, somewhere in the heart of Europe? Or if the Americans are so keen on Israel, why not take Israel and put it somewhere in the United States of America?
Which is a huge plot of land, the United States.
Exactly. lots of places to choose from. But if we look at what you've just said on coming into equity with clean hands, and the fact that we do have Jewish communities and people who have come out actually against the Zionist movement, saying that this is wrong, this is not exactly...
Even rabbis, right? You have rabbis coming out saying that the issue with Israel and Palestine is not an issue of Judaism and Islam, essentially, because it has been hijacked by the political identity or political entity that is Zionism.
But if we look at this, and a lot of people are going to continue using religion as an excuse to perpetuate whatever it is they want. It can be anything from land, it can be natural resources, and we've seen this in Iraq and a few other countries as well. What are some of the, I suppose, what is the influence of these individuals who are going against the Zionist movements? Do they have any clout at all?
Well, I think, personally speaking, based on what we see on social media, especially on Twitter, there seems to be this shift in supporting Israel beforehand. And now, because people are becoming more realized and they have the opportunity to engage with people more from different and diverse backgrounds, there is this shift that we can see even on Instagram, when people post photos about what's going on and videos of what's going on. You can see the shift of people understanding that the Palestinian issue is essentially an issue of human rights, an issue of democracy, an issue of liberty and freedoms.
Yes.
And I think this is what we're supposed to do, to have an awareness, and it's a different kind of understanding, a different kind of awareness, because we live in a world that is now without boundaries, right? It's borderless.
More so thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yep.
I want to shoot back to Dr. AZZAM and find out your thoughts on this. We know that Israel has stopped the vaccines from coming into Gaza. We know that it has been extremely difficult for our friends and family there, especially now with COVID-19, a recent bombing of the hospitals. What are some of your thoughts on what Arief just mentioned earlier?
Well, according to international law, if we talk about international law, although it's really, in the case of Palestine, it's rarely implemented, because you need power behind it, behind any law, in order for it to be implemented. But according to international law, Israel is an occupying power. And an occupying power, according to the Geneva Convention, has responsibility for the people living under its occupation. Despite that, Israel does not treat the Palestinians as people who are under occupation. It treats them as people waiting for transfer, for removal, for eviction. And therefore, they have no rights recognized whatsoever. And we had this problem with the COVID-19. The Israelis got vaccinated so quickly. Actually, Israel is one of the earliest countries to have most, if not all, of its citizens vaccinated early on. But when it comes to the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, it said it had nothing to do with it. And with all the restrictions imposed and the siege in the case of Gaza, it's really very, very difficult. And that's why until now, only a small minority of Palestinians have been able to get the vaccination.
I'm just trying to understand how effective soft laws are, and all of these international conventions. You had mentioned earlier about the Geneva Convention, and this has been used several times already, but time and time again in history, especially with regard to the Palestinian and the Israeli situation, it has not materialized the way the international community, as we mentioned earlier, wanted it to be. So does the UN have any power in this case?
You see, international law is supposed to be an instrument of the United Nations. I mean, the United Nations is supposed to act according to the laws which derive from whatever decisions are made by its experts or by its institutions. Unfortunately, the United Nations is the most corrupt international agency in the history of humanity, because it's so undemocratic to the extent that its Security Council, which has the executive power, is controlled by 5 members. Look how many countries there are in the world, and only 5 members control decision-making when it comes to world affairs. And each one of these members, including the United States of America, has the right to veto any decision. Hundreds of times decisions are reached or are proposed, there are draft resolutions, and then the United States, in some cases Russia, in some cases China, use the veto in order to prevent the process from coming to completion. It's really useless. And that's why, as in the case of South Africa, I think we in Palestine are heading in that way. We need to work along two tracks. First, the local struggle. The Palestinians have no option but to continue their struggle. And by the way, they have no choice. They really have no choice but to continue the struggle. The second track is to build an international, a global movement against Zionism. Just like in the 80s and the 90s, a global movement against apartheid was established, and it brought about significant change. I mean, can you imagine that at one time, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States of America, considered Nelson Mandela a terrorist? Imagine. And then, after his people became victorious, he became a hero, a world hero. He has even a statue today in Westminster, in the UK. Similarly, we Palestinians today are called by some governments terrorists. Our liberation movement is labeled as a terrorist organization. One day the world will come to realize that we are freedom fighters, that we are fighting for justice, we are fighting for the truth, and the truth is on our side.
Dr. AZZAM, there's this saying, I can't remember who it was by. Essentially, someone's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and vice versa. So going by this quote, right? It's basically who gets to say and who gets to write history and who gets to give laws its meanings that are essentially the kingmakers and
the writers of history.
The writers of history, yes. So do we have to then look at the UN as something that is flawed?
You see, luckily, history is not written by contemporaries. History is usually written by people who come afterwards. And that's why we will always have a sound, authentic version of history. There are people who try to fabricate things and write the wrong things, but eventually there will be people who will write the right things. Like for instance, the new historians, new historians in Israel, who came to realize that actually the Nakba that happened in 1948 was ethnic cleansing was genocide, was a form of genocide. So there will always be people who will write the authentic version of history. But let me tell you this frankly. Without power, you are worth nothing. Without power, you cannot protect justice and truth. Justice and truth need to have force behind them. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to us in Al-Quran, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ وَمِن رِّبَاطِ الْخَيْلِ تُرْهِبُونَ بِهِ عَدُوَّ اللَّهِ وَعَدُوَّكُمْ وَآخَرِينَ مِن دُونِهِمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَهُمْ اللَّهُ يَعْلَمُهُمْ. You have to prepare for them as much force as you can, including the reins of the horse. Why? Because if you have no power, they don't care about you. Imagine if Gaza didn't have the rockets. Imagine what Israel could have done. Imagine if the Palestinians didn't have the will to fight until they have victory or have martyrdom. The Israelis can do even worse than what they are doing. So we need to build that momentum locally as well as internationally.
Very humbling words, and of course we see the footage of, I believe this is breaking fast in front of Al-Aqsa. Of course, towards the end of Ramadan, in fact the 25th of Ramadan this year, the violent clashes happened, causing unnecessary harm. Sorry, yes. Eid al-Fitr, yeah. Yeah, that was Eid al-Fitr. Now, Dr. AZZAM, you were talking about the importance that justice will prevail, history will have its space where the true version or the more accurate version of history will see. But until then, there will be quite a few more clashes. And I thought it was poignant when you said the struggle will have to continue and they do not have an option for that. Yeah,
there's the lived reality and there's no option. I mean, we can sit here and talk about this, but we're not living it. And the only thing we can do perhaps is to have more awareness and to make dua, because dua is actually a very powerful tool for us to do anything in life, actually.
We were talking to Dr. AZZAM earlier about why Zionism has got nothing to do with true Judaism, and it's not to do with the religion per se. Now, as we wrap up and as we head towards the end of the discussion, tomorrow we're going to have another really big discussion. I just wanted to put it out there. What is the difference? Or what is Zionism and what is anti-Semitism? Because we've been using these jargons all this while, and I'm not sure if everybody, in fact, I myself, would understand this fully. Dr. AZZAM, would you like to weigh in as we head towards the end?
Well, anti-Semitism is a European phenomenon in its origins, because the Jews were persecuted in Europe. They were subjected to pogroms and then eventually the Holocaust. That phenomenon was called anti-Semitism, which means hating the Jews. And it's true, the Christians of Europe had these ill feelings for the Jews for a number of reasons. Some are old and historic, some are new, some are whatever. But actually now anti-Semitism is used as a weapon by the Zionists in order to silence the critics of Israel. And that's very dangerous. Today, I was reading a brilliant piece by a British journalist called Jonathan Cook. He published it in Middle East Eye. And he says, you see, why do we have this problem recurring in Palestine? Because there is an ideology here in the state. The ideology of the state in Israel prevents it from reaching a settlement with the Palestinians that would end occupation in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and that would end the siege over Gaza. It's an ideology that prevents Israel from being even-handed and from treating its Palestinian citizens, that is Palestinians of 1948, as equal human beings. And this ideology is called Zionism. It's an ideology that claims that a Jew is better than anybody else, that a Jew has a license from God to go and kill others and take their land. Of course, many Jews don't believe in this. Many Jews don't accept this. Many Jews are abhorrent about this. But actually, the state of Israel believes in this. And that's why we have this problem. And because people are so abhorred and are so angry about what Israel is doing, they want to silence them. Whoever speaks, they call him anti-Semite. And that's what they did to Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party. They brought him down under this false accusation that he was an anti-Semite. And he is not an anti-Semite. He is just a critic of a Zionist entity called Israel that is perpetrating crimes against humanity, that is perpetrating war crimes.
Thank you so very much, Dr. AZZAM, for weighing in this evening. Now, we will see him again tomorrow. Thank you so much for spending time with us. MashaAllah, I think a lot of the things that you've shared with us today is not only food for thought, but a real eye-opener. I want to end tonight's session with a quote from you, Dr. AZZAM. You said, read as much as you can, but make sure you verify what you're reading. Don't take anything you hear or read for granted, because there are many illusions around. Thank you so much for leaving that quote. Now, the Untold story continues tomorrow. I'll be in the studio with Brother Zairul Shafuddin from International Relief Malaysia, and also Dr. AZZAM Tamimi will be joining us again tomorrow, and inshallah, God willing, we'll have a clear and stable line, and we will reach out to young Nadine Abdul Latif from Gaza. This is Nadiah.
Arief, Subhan, thank you so much.
Stay safe.
This land gives us all that makes life worth living. April's blushing advances, the aroma of bread at dawn, a woman's haranguing of men, the poetry of Aeschylus, love's trembling beginning, moss on a stone, mothers dancing on a flute's thread, and the invader's fear of memories. This land gives us all that makes life worth living. September's rustling and a woman leaving 40 behind with her apricots, an hour of sunlight in prison, clouds reflecting swarms of insects, a people's applause for those who laugh at their erasure, and the tyrant's fear of songs. This land gives us all that makes life worth living. Lady Earth, mother of all beginnings and endings. She was called Palestine, and she is still called Palestine. My lady, because you are my lady, I deserve life.